This recipe is for beef bourguignon. This is a very old and classic recipe. It has a very specific way in which it's normally made. I am going to break those rules. I'm going to do some things that are not traditional to the recipe, but you know, that's the beauty of cooking. It evolves. You don't just keep making exactly the same thing every single time, or you never learn anything, you never improve anything. This I've made thousands of times by now, and I'm beginning with what would be called in the United States an eye of round roast. It's sirloin, and part of it, you want to make sure that you trim this. You've got silver skin here. You want to get rid of this. You want to cube the meat, and you want to make sure you run through with your fingers. You're going to have parts that have sinew and tendons in them, and you want to get all that out. And you want to have nice, straight pieces of meat that don't have any of this in here. And this is, as you open it up, you get these areas that are called fascia, and these all have to go. You can save this off to the side and use it for stock, or you can include it in hamburger that you're grinding up if you're grinding your own meat. But in this recipe itself, this all has to go because this will produce very tough, chewy bites. This will not break down well in the braise. As we're progressing here, we're getting pieces that are nice and smooth, that don't have any tough spots in them, and then we get pieces like this that have strands of fibers that are very tough, and they run through it too much to by the time I take out all that fiber, there won't be enough left for a good cube of meat. So we're just toss it into the heap for hamburger or for some other application. Its stock is usually beef broth would be a good thing to use this for. This is all useless. You have to accept that. It doesn't mean you have to throw it away. It just means you can't use it for bourguignon. Now you have these pieces. It's just a matter of cubing them up. And you run your fingers through it, you might find an occasional other piece. You know, bourguignon is one of those peasant dishes, and everybody loves peasant food, except the peasants, of course, who had to eat it. They didn't have any choice. But the peasant dishes are often very, very good because they're very flavorful, and they use cheap pieces of meat. And this is quite an inexpensive piece of meat, but the flavor in the end will be very good, and it'll be tender if it's cooked properly. Okay, now we begin cutting these pieces for the bourguignon. And you look at where the grain is running along this meat, and you want to make sure that you cut perpendicular to this grain, because you want to keep the fibers as short as possible. That'll help make the meat tender in the end. If you start cutting like this, you're going to end up with pieces of meat that have long fibers, and it'll be very chewy in the end. So you always pay attention to the grain. You don't just cut it because it's the shape of the meat. You cut it against the grain. And you want pretty large pieces in here, because as it cooks, it's going to shrink a lot, and you don't want to end up with something that's little tiny itty bitty pieces. You want to make sure that you have nice sized chunks of meat in this stew, and really that's what it is. So I've cut it across the grain one time. You see the grain running this way, cutting it across the grain again. Now these are pretty large pieces. This is more than you would put in your mouth at one time, but this is going to shrink a lot. Okay. All the meat's been cubed up. Now I got the container that we're going to marinate this in, and I'm going to liberally coat the bottom of the container with coarse black pepper, put the meat in. Now this marination process is not traditional, and it will produce meat that has more of a gamey flavor to it. Personally, I like that. I like a bourguignon that tastes more like it was made with elk than it was made with beef. Some people do not. Some people do not like that taste, and in which case you can just skip the marinade process and continue on from here. But I think this is really what gives bourguignon the unusual nature of it. Otherwise, it's just nothing more than a beef stew if you don't do this. So we've got the pepper that's been on the bottom and the top. We're going to mix this together. As you can see, I used quite a lot. Next, we're going to add a couple of cloves of garlic in here. Just roughly hewn, doesn't have to be anything exact. A couple of bay leaves. And now we've got the Côte d'Aron wine. which I've kept in the refrigerator. I refrigerated the wine overnight before I started making this, and then that way the warmth of the wine won't start decaying the meat. You don't have to do that, but it's a professional trick. If you're going to use wine for marinade, you want to refrigerate it ahead of time so you've got the meat never gets warmed up. It doesn't start spoiling. And I just add enough to cover the meat. This is not a real cheap wine either. If you use something like Paul Masson Burgundy, the end result will not have a good depth of flavor, and it'll have some weird off notes in it because that kind of wine is not really suitable for cooking. Meat's completely covered with the wine. We're going to put a lid on it, stick it in the refrigerator for 1 to 2 days. Every once in a while, you open it up, you stir the meat around again while it's in the refrigerator, and it has been 2 days now. The next step is to take the meat out carefully, because we've got to save this marinade. We're going to be using the wine that the meat was marinating in the sauce. So we're putting this on paper towel carefully, and I shake off each piece. You don't want to lose the marinade by having it all go into the paper towel, of course, and just line it all up, dry it out. Now, while this meat is warming up, we're going to just let it sit at room temperature. We're going to cut up the bacon. Got some cube bacon here. We're just going to cut it up into reasonable sized pieces. You don't have to be too careful about this, because really we're just rendering the fat out of it, and it's going to be discarded in the end anyway. We have a pan with some simmering water. I'm going to put the pieces of bacon in there and let it cook for about 5 minutes. Okay, it's been about 5 minutes. We're going to remove this off. Just a paper towel to drain it, and meanwhile get a pan with about a tablespoon of olive oil heating up. Bacon's been patted dry, and now we add it to the pan with the olive oil, and we're going to cook this slow to render the fat out of the bacon. That's what we're trying to get. So we're going to use the fat from the bacon to cook the meat. So the bacon is gradually rendering over medium heat. Meanwhile, in another pan, we're going to add some olive oil and begin sauteing our onion for this. About 125 grams of onion, about 4 ounces. Meanwhile, while this is going on, we've got the meat that's been draining on the paper towel. We're going to put another layer over it and dry it out a little bit more. Get it ready for the fry. It needs to be dry if it's going to brown. The onions are cooking away. They're soft, but they're not ready yet. And now we've got back to the bacon. This has rendered out enough fat for us. So we're going to remove these pieces to a plate. We'll be using them later. Don't throw them away. And then we're going to crank the heat on this and begin frying the beef. Now the heat goes way up on this. We've got our fat in there. Give it a minute for the fat to get even hotter. Fat's very hot now. You need to do this in batches so that you don't crowd the pan. While this was cooking, or possibly earlier, you need to cut up the carrots and small onions for this. You can use boiling onions, or you can use shallots if you like. Then if they're banana shallots, cut them in half. You want the pieces to be large chunks, not necessarily even, because this is a rustic dish. Peasant dish doesn't mean it should be crude, but the pieces don't have to be perfectly even. And after a couple of minutes, you can see we got some nice color on this. That's what we're looking for. Do this on 2 sides of the meat. And then we're going to move it to a platter, do the rest of the meat. Meanwhile, the oven should be preheating right now to about 220 degrees Celsius. Meat's got good brown going on it on both sides, so we're going to transfer this off to the platter. and proceed on with the next batch of meat in the same pan. Just like we did before. And meanwhile, my pan with the onions, which is going to become the braising liquid, is starting to get some color on it. You don't want them real brown, but you want them to have some color. So now we're going to add the tomato sauce to this, about 2 ounces, 60 grams, and we're going to start cooking this for a little bit while we continue to brown the meat and the oven continues to preheat. After all the meat has been sautéed, we're going to add the juices from that back into the pan. This is our browned meat, the first browning, and now those vegetables go in here. We're going to start getting some color on those using the fat and the juices from the meat. And these are going to cook for quite a while. Meanwhile, you take an empty pan, the pan that you plan to use, the casserole dish that you plan to use for the meat, and you put it into the oven while it's still preheating actually. You want that pan to be very, very hot. Now we have our dish of meat that's been browned one time. We're going to sprinkle this liberally with flour and massage it in. You want to get this meat coated in the flour. Part of the secret of the recipe is the browning of this a second time. It's been browned once on the outside. Now it's got some kind of sticky, goopy flour that's going to make the crust on it. Now we've got some nice color on these vegetables. Now we're going to add our beef stock to this. And we're going to let this come to a slow boil and begin to reduce. Meanwhile, we've got the tomato sauce and onions that we're cooking, and this is looking pretty good. Everything's soft, tomato sauce is incorporated. Now to this we're going to add the reserve marinade that we had, along with the garlic that was in it and the bay leaf. This all goes together in the same pan and it comes to a slow simmer. Now these onions and carrots are just going to keep cooking in this liquid as it reduces down, and as this liquid reduces down and gets very thick. So on top of the stove we have the what will become the sauce, and the vegetables are slowly simmering in the beef stock, and then inside the oven, which is now preheated, we have this empty vessel. I'm going to put about 1/4 of a cup of olive oil in this, maybe a little bit less. You want quite a bit though. And to this, we're going to add the meat that had the flour added to it. Yeah, the tricky part to do without burning yourself. Grab hold of the pan and toss the meat around in the hot olive oil. And because the casserole dish was so hot, that olive oil got hot right away. And that's it. We're going to put this in the oven now, just like that, for about 7 minutes at this high temperature at 220. 7 minutes has elapsed, and now it's time to pull this out and do the same thing again. We're going to toss the meat around in the oil, make sure it's all getting some exposure to the edges of the pan. And we're going to give it about 5 more minutes. Meanwhile, the onions and carrots continue to simmer away in the beef broth. And our pan that had the marinade and the onions and tomato sauce in the beginning is now at a simmer. We're going to add that bacon that we used in the beginning, and about 3/4 of a teaspoon of thyme. Turn the heat down on this and let it just sit at a slight simmer. We're going to use this over the meat in just a minute. 5 more minutes has elapsed. 5 more minutes. And this is what it looks like. Now we're going to add that marinade with the tomatoes and the onions that we made earlier. Let it simmer. And give this one more stir. Now the long process of the braise. Lid goes on. The oven temperature goes down to 160. Don't forget to do that, or you will destroy this meat because it's very hot oven right now. So we're going to lower it to 160 and let it cook for about 2.5 to 3 hours. Meanwhile, the carrots and the onions on top of the pan are still cooking, and you can see how thick this is getting now. This is reduced. It isn't dry, but it is getting close to being dry. And that's the point. We're just going to turn this off. It's had enough. We're going to use this later on. We'll just put a lid on it to preserve it, set it aside. We'll come back to this later. Carrots and onions are still sitting there under the cover, and this is actually the time I'm making the potato galette decoration that's going to go under it. Next we're going to take care of these mushrooms. You're going to squeeze a little bit of lemon juice on them. Set them aside for a few minutes while the pan gets hot. The pan with the olive oil and butter is hot. I'm going to add the mushrooms. You can see this is a single layer and the mushrooms are whole. We're not going to crowd the pan. There's still plenty of room around it. You don't want to have the mushrooms stacked up on top of each other or they won't brown properly. And what we're looking to do here is develop some color on them. This is not the only cooking they're going to get. They're going to go in with the meat in a little while. But right now we're just trying to get some color on them and some flavor in them. Now the mushroom caps have got some color on them. We're going to add about an ounce of cognac. And it's going to be quite a spectacular flame. That only for a second. Just make sure you stand back when you do that, or you won't have any eyebrows left. Okay, that looks pretty good. We got some color and flavor on them. We're going to kill the heat and set these aside too. And this is what you want to see. Beautiful golden color on these mushrooms. Remove this from the oven after 3 hours. I'm going to remove the lid now. We're going to fish out the pieces of meat from this. Just the pieces of meat. We're going to put them on a plate first before we proceed. This is very, very tender meat now. Having pulled the meat out of this, now we've got the liquid, and we're going to rub this through a sieve. This is where we get rid of the bay leaf and any other solids that are in there. Now, back into the same casserole dish, we're going to add the vegetables from before, along with all that reduced stock. The liquid that you just got from this, you can skim the fat from this if you want to. It's up to you. I don't. In restaurants we don't. That's flavor. It'll melt into the beef. It won't be visible in the end. And then finally, the beef itself. Now we've gotten rid of most of the solids. We're going to stir this around, and this goes back into the oven for another 20 minutes before we're going to add the mushrooms. So this is good. Cover goes back on. 20 more minutes. Now after that 20 minutes has passed, We can open up the oven, move the lid, watch out, it's very hot. And finally, we're going to add in these mushrooms that we sauteed earlier. We're on the home stretch now, it's almost finished. Give this a quick stir. And it goes in the very last cooking time. It's very thick now. That's the way I like it. If you like it thinner, you can add more water. I like it very thick. Also look for my cocktail book, Cocktails of the South Pacific and Beyond, Advanced Mixology, available through Amazon online.